Okay, so I could be the poster child for procrastinators of America, which is usually not the worst thing in the world, except when you have technical difficulties. So I got the slideshow done last night, and I couldn't post it because I couldn't get any of the computers in the house to hook up to any of the hotspots. So it's on Blackboard this morning. Sorry it wasn't there last night. And also couldn't work on the test because I couldn't get online. So the test, I will email you when the test is available. And then I will give you, in the email, I'll tell you when I'm gonna make it unavailable. But it'll probably be like noon on Sunday. So I'll give you a little extra time. But yeah, I could even be the president of Procrastinators America, but we never have meetings because we always put them off. So let's see if we can get through the last of this part of the lesson today. If we don't, I'm just going to make y'all responsible for what's in the book because I'm really kind of ready to move on to the next part. All right, so we were talking about foreign and domestic issues. French War, the French Revolution was part of it. And in 1793, the British never left. We've talked about that. They're kind of lurking around on the fringes of Canada. In the Great Lakes region, they've got some forts. And in 1793, they make the announcement, we're not leaving. We're just going to stay. They're trying to force the Americans to pay the reparations from the Revolutionary War. They also would kind of like to get the colonies back, but they're not that overt. And they start seizing American ships. Now, we don't know what a real lake is. What we have for lakes are puddles. The Great Lakes are real lakes. It looks more like an ocean. You can take ships into it. And there are shippers who, if you can actually get sea access coming this way, down, you can get to here. But you have big shipping within the Great Lakes. And the British start seizing American ships. They also seize them on the open ocean, but it's in the Great Lakes is kind of where we're having issues. And not only are they taking the ships, they're taking the sailors. Because they fall on this policy of once British, always British. And y'all were British just a few years ago. So obviously all of you sailors are British, right? So now we can put you into our Navy. So they're forcing the sailors into the British Navy or imprisoning them. And people are starting to get mad. They're also, again, inciting the Indians in the Ohio River Valley to attack frontier settlements. They're not the only ones, the Spanish are doing it too. So in April of 1794, on April 16th, John Jay is sent to Britain with orders to get the British out, gain reparations for the shippers, get compensation for the slaves lost during the Revolution, and legalize trade with the British West Indies because they're still a little hacked off that when we lost the war, Britain, had the gall to say, well, we don't like you anymore. You can't trade with our colonies. Actually, kind of a natural reaction, but the New England merchants didn't see it that way. So this is what Jay is supposed to do. And Jay is a pretty good negotiator. He was one of the three that ended the revolution with the Treaty of Paris. So he gets to England, and what he gets instead is he gets a treaty. They call it Jay's Treaty in the Americas. They call it the Treaty of London, is its actual title. Jay concedes to accept the British definition of neutrality, which states they go by what they call the Rule of 1756, meaning that trade prohibited in peacetime could not open up in wartime, and that exports of war goods to warring nations is contraband. So if you're shipping war goods to France or to England, really, you're violating neutrality laws. But the British have a wide definition of what war goods mean. It could be foodstuffs. You know, you could be shipping flour to the French. By extension, you're supporting their war, and that's contraband, and therefore your ship can be seized. The British were given most favored nation treatment in terms of trade, and they also got the promise that French warships would not be outfitted in the States. Therefore, you couldn't send a ship, or a ship could not be bought in the States and then outfitted for war. He did not get the compensation for the slaves, and he had to promise that the U.S. government would make good on all the debts owed to the British merchants. So far, this is a very one-sided treaty. But he did get the British out of the Great Lakes forts. He did get a promise of reparations for the ships seized, and we're talking hundreds of ships. And they legalized trade with the British West Indies with restrictions. So there were strings attached. It was probably the best that Jay could do. And the situation on the frontier was really starting to get heated, to the point where Washington feared another war with Britain. And Britain we did defeat them, but they are like the leading world power. So Jay comes home with his treaty, presents it to the Senate. It's not well received. It almost starts a civil war. Poor Jay is hung in effigy, which is better than being hung in reality, but still kind of embarrassing, to be paraded down the street with a noose around your neck. There was some support, a little bit in the Federalists. They did support the British in this European conflict, but they were disappointed in the trade restrictions. The Democratic Republicans, Jefferson's group, supported the French. They didn't want anything to do with this treaty. They felt we were kowtowing to the British. And it barely passes, barely ratified. And it is a very sectional vote. The New England and Middle states are 80% for it. The South is 74% against it. Like I said, Washington was disappointed, but he wants to avoid war with Britain. Madison tries to sink it. He tries some backstage scheming. We think dirty politics is a recent thing. It's not. Politics has been politics forever. People are human, and people scheme to get what they feel is in their best interest, or sometimes what they feel is in the best interest of the country, but is maybe contrary to that. It's their idea of the best interest. So Madison is scheming to have it thwart the passage. He demands to see all the papers related to the treaty. Washington pulls a card that presidents pull all the time now, but wasn't actually named back then. Basically, he pulls executive privilege, and he says no. The House has nothing to do with ratifying treaties. It's none of your business. And Madison and Washington will not be friends after that. They lose a friendship over this. And in the next little section we talk about, you're going to see a lot of friendships lost, which is kind of sad. Okay, more domestic issues. The Northwest frontier is not the only frontier. Well, actually, we're still talking about the Northwest, but we're talking about the lower Northwest now. So, this area. This was what we were talking about before. We're down here. Still have Indians. Conflicts with Indians are escalating, mostly because more people are moving into the area. And Washington says, okay, we're going to send the army in. It's actually a militia, but we're going to send them in. Under General Anthony Wayne, he takes, I want to say, 2,600 men. They build Fort Greenville, and they go on the offensive. Wayne was not a wilting flower. He wasn't going to sit there and wait for the Indians to come to him. They go on the offensive, and they end up in a big battle at Fallen Timbers. It's called the Battle of Fallen Timbers. It was Anthony's 2,600 against kind of roughly an even number. They may have had more. They may have had like 500 on them, but it was a group of Shawnee, Ottawa, Chippewa, the Tamawa, and Canadian militia. So you have some Brits in there again. And they attack Wayne south of Detroit. The American militia is more than successful. Not only do they beat them in the battle, they destroy the villages and fields of the Indians, basically leaving them to starve for the rest of the year. And the Indians concede and sign a treaty in August of 1975, wherein the United States buys from 12 tribes the southeastern quarter of the Northwest Territory. So Ohio, Indiana, plus Detroit, Chicago, and Vincennes. And pretty much in the Indian issues in the Northwest Territory. Between Jay's Treaty and the Treaty of Greenville, the Indians are pretty much defeated and pushed across the Mississippi River. So it's just a continuation. As settlers are pushing this way, Indians are also pushing this way, and we push them over to the other side. Because Mississippi is our boundary, there are people eyeing it, but we're not there yet. More domestic issues. Open rebellion is going to break out in Pennsylvania over that liquor tax that Hamilton proposed. We talked about how it was a whole lot cheaper, or not cheaper, it was more profitable to take your corn and make it into whiskey than it was to just sell your corn. And a lot of the frontier farmers were doing that. It wasn't just corn. You could, when apples and peaches are in season, you can make those into liquor. Anything that ferments can be made into liquor, just about. You may not want to drink it, but pretty much anything that ferments can be made into liquor. And the distillers were evading and resisting this tax. And it finally breaks into open rebellion in Pennsylvania. Washington will again send in the militia, but this time it's almost 13,000 militia go in under General Henry Lee. You bring in the actual army. They get there, and there's no resistance. The rebellion suddenly has gone poof. And by rebellion, I mean there are people blowing up stills. if you were an actual honest distiller and you were paying your taxes, your neighbors who don't want to pay the taxes are going to blow up your stills. There was a lot of infighting. But when they get there, it's kind of like if you go back to that Gatsby affair, nobody saw anything. They do arrest a few guys, but basically they're way down on the food chain as far as the vigilante organization. Washington pardons them because he says one's a simpleton and the other one's insane. But the issue becomes, and Hamilton actually gets involved with it. He runs in with the militia. But the problem that it causes is people see the federal government, that strong central federal government, attacking its own people. That's the take that comes out of this. So keep that in the back of your mind. It causes great resentment. Another treaty, like I mentioned with this, when we talked about the British, the Spanish were also inciting Indians. Well, they're arming the Indians more in the south, along that part of the Mississippi, say Tennessee down. In Tennessee, the settlers and the Indians get into it with the settlers burning all their villages. And the Spanish are seeing the writing on the wall. You know, the British conceded. They beat the Indians at Fallen Timbers. The Tennessee settlers are burning the villages of the Indians. Maybe we should just make some peace and get on with it. And, you know, the British are inciting the Indians, the Spanish are inciting the Indians. We're not any better. We're inciting the Indians we're allied with to attack the British and the Spanish. You know, let's just have everybody attacking along the frontier. So Pinckney goes in to talk. Thomas Pinckney is the one sent. And he does a little bit better than Jay. He wins acceptance of the 31st parallel versus the Yazoo River that the Spanish wanted for the boundary. He gets open access to the Mississippi River, which is very valuable if you're if you're a frontier farmer. You know, that takes you straight to the Gulf Coast where you can load things on ships and get them out of there. They get the right to transport goods to New Orleans. New Orleans becomes an open port. And a commission is going to be set up to settle the claims against the Spanish. And then there's a promise on both sides to refrain from inciting Indian attacks. Thomas Pinckney comes home a hero. He's not dragged through the streets, hung in effigy. It's an immensely popular treaty, and it kind of settles things on that southwestern frontier for a while. Things get a little bit better with our Spanish neighbors. Because you've got to remember, the Spanish are in Florida, all the way across here and up here. And during all of this, people are trying to flood west. We have open lands. And the conversation turns to how best to deal with these lands. We've already had some land acts. There is a pattern of settlement started. But the Federalists say, well, we need to change it. Land is basically the only big thing that the country has to make money with. And yeah, we're taxing people, we're raising money that way, we've got the bank, but land is your quick cash. We need to charge more, make more money. What they're hiding in that statement is if we charge more, less speculators will buy the land, but less small people, less labor grade people are going to be flooding west because they can't afford those prices. And they want to keep a good labor base in the New England and the middle colonies for manufacturing. You've got to have labor. And if everybody floods west, you're going to have to pay more for labor in the east. So they favor selling large parcels of land to speculators. Republicans, following Jefferson's idea of a country of small agrarian farmers, wants just to fill the country up quickly. Well, the Federalists win. They get the Land Act of 1796. It basically extends those rectangular surveys westward, but land goes up to $2 an acre with only 1 year to pay. Half of the townships are the way they were in the last Land Act. One section township, 640 acres. They sell obviously for $1,280. The other half were 8 section blocks, much bigger townships. And the price accordingly is much higher, $10,240, which only speculators would be able to buy. Most people, general people, don't have that much money. And obviously speculators didn't have that much either, because by 1800, the Federal Land Office had sold less than 50,000 acres. They add 2 more land acts. The Land Act of 1800 cuts the minimum acreage bought to a half a section that could be paid over 4 years. And in 04, they cut that down to a quarter section, 160 acres, which as we go forward, that's going to be the size of a homestead. So when we get to the Homestead Acts, that's going to be the size, and they cut the price down to $1.64 an acre. So the Federalists win, but in the end, the Republicans do, because they aren't selling the land and they got to cut the prices. And it's time for a new election. And Washington isn't going to stay. This time he says two terms is enough for anybody. He's still the most popular man in the country. He probably could have very easily won the election. But now we have 2 political parties, and things are going to get ugly. When he leaves on September 17th, he makes a plea for unity within the country. Put aside your partisanship. And he warns against making permanent alliances with European nations, i.e. like the one we did with France. It's caused problems. Not do that again. What he can claim, and we always blame the president for whatever's going on. The president doesn't do as much as we give them credit for. But while he was president, we've created a new national government with demonstrated power. We've established secure national credit. We've recovered territory from Britain and Spain. We've kind of got a stable frontier. And the country's added 3 new states, Vermont, Kentucky, and Tennessee. So there's a lot of growth in those 8 years that Washington was president. A lot of good has happened. But now it's time for him to leave. Can I switch to yes to writing? Okay. So the election of 1796. It's the first partisan election. The Federalists choose John Adams as their presidential candidate and Thomas Pinckney, the one that made the very popular treaty, as the vice president. The Republicans choose Thomas Jefferson and Aaron Burr. By choosing Aaron Burr, they're tying Virginia and New York, which are the 2 strongest states. And you'll see this combination a lot through our elections. It is an intensely partisan election. There's a lot of mudslinging. But when the vote comes down, it's pretty clear that the Federalists are going to win, and that would make John Adams president. But there's an issue. Hamilton thinks Pinckney would be more influenceable. John Adams has a backbone. They may not think he does, but he does. And Hamilton realizes this, and he thinks, we need to get more votes for Aaron Burr and make him president. Because at this point, the Electoral College is just a simple vote. Whoever gets the most votes wins. There's not a party. This is our first partisan election. They haven't worked out all the bugs. It's not party line. So Hamilton schemes to have some of the South Carolina electors hold their votes for Pinckney rather than giving them to Burr, or rather than giving them to Adams. That would make him president and Adams vice president. And, poor Adams thought that the vice presidency was the most useless job ever contrived. So I'm sure he doesn't want to do that for another 4 years. And it backfires because a New England delegation overhears the conversation and they change their votes. And when it's all said and done and all the votes are counted, John Adams has the most votes. But Thomas Pinckney does not have the second most. Thomas Jefferson does. So now you have a Federalist president with a Republican vice president. Because it's a simple vote. There's no party line issues. And Adams thinks that they can work together. But Jefferson has gotten a little bit prickly about this whole issue. And while he claims he's not, he is. And it's not going to work out quite so well. But John Adams is president now. He is kind of a short, chunky little man. He is vain. He is cantankerous. He is very British. He way too often uses the word monarch for president. Even though he was not a monarchist, he was definitely devoted to the new country. He comes across as a monarch. But he is well suited for the job. He is definitely qualified. He had a distinguished career as a Massachusetts lawyer. Remember, if you go back, he was the one that defended the soldiers in the Boston Massacre. He had been one of the key leaders in the Revolutionary Movement. He was probably one of the most hardworking members of the Continental Congress, serving on over 80 committees. He had been a diplomat to France, Holland, and Britain. He had been Washington's vice president. These are all good qualifications. He's seen the government from a lot of different angles. Politically, he's in the middle, but much like today, the middle is a very lonely place to be, and somewhat unappreciated. He personally feared the concept of democracy and considered equality a fanciful notion. Rich people were better for a reason. But he was level-headed, and he's going to manage to keep his head when those around him aren't, which probably cost him a second term in office. The first issues he really had to deal with, besides the fact that his vice president wasn't really an ally, was the war with France. Jay's Treaty had caused more problems than just its acceptance at home. By accepting the British definition of neutrality, the French said, okay, you're going to accept it, then anything you're carrying is war contraband pretty much, and we're starting to take your ships. So the French start a naval war. It's an undeclared naval war, but that is one of the first acts of a war, is to fire on a ship. And they start taking ships, and they take more ships than the British had in the Great Lakes. We're going to lose about 300 ships to them by 1797. The French have also kicked out our diplomats, and they won't accept any new diplomats. So John Adams decides we've got to restore relations with the French. And he's doing this, he decides this while the Federalists, his party, are calling for war. The Federalists are saying, no, let's just go to war with the French. They're taking our ships, they're anti-British, let's just go to war with them. They're fighting everybody else. And their whole revolution is a sham. It's not a great revolution like our revolution. So they deserve to have war declared on them. Adams is like, no, let's just stay out of it. But we got to make peace. They keep taking our ships. So he sends Charles Pinckney, either the brother or cousin to Thomas, I can't remember, along with John Marshall and Elbridge Gerry, old Rumbletonian, to Paris with a diplomatic message. Well, they are not immediately accepted. And they're approached by three men who they labeled X, Y, and Z, who demand a bribe payment of $250,000 before the French government will see them. Now, this was actually a common practice in Europe. Diplomats often paid bribes to get in. We're not European. This was not customary for us. And they say no. When it comes back to the colonies, so they come back to the colonies with this report and this story. Now everybody's really up in arms. They want to bribe us. We're not going for that. Adams still resists. Don't declare war. But Congress goes ahead and authorizes the capture of French ships. Again, an act of war, but we're not declaring war. Suspends trade with France and denounces the Treaty of 1778, which is kind of a dead letter anyway. But, it's a face-saving move. Adams does start strengthening the Army and the Navy. The Navy had actually started, I mentioned this before, we didn't talk about it in detail, but the Algerian pirates were attacking American ships. Washington started a shipbuilding program, but in the meantime, he actually bought off, so we do bribe people, he bought off the Algerians. They quit taking our ships, but we'd already started 3 of them. So, let's go ahead and finish them. So they built the United States, the Constitution, and the Constellation. And they were finished in 1797. In 1798, Congress is going to actually create a Department of the Navy, and they authorize an army of 10,000 men for 3 years. Now, you got to remember, y'all have always had, there's always been armed forces in your life. But in colonial days and in early American days, and this is the same in Europe, armies were the arm of a tyrant. No one wanted a standing army. So as soon as the revolution was done, poof, the army's gone. So we don't have an army. We have state militias that can be called up, but they don't, it's not like they're just sitting there waiting with their guns. They're farmers and merchants and laborers. And when it's time to call them up, you got to get them all together, you got to get them armed. we didn't have that. But now Congress is saying, okay, we're going to have an army for 3 years. Adams asked Washington to be he is commander-in-chief as the president, but he puts Washington in charge of the army. Washington says, I'll do it, but only if Hamilton can be my second in command, which was kind of an insult to Adams, because Adams didn't ask Hamilton. But he let it go, he let it slide. Doesn't like Hamilton, but that's okay. And they start building this up. At the same time, the French are kind of losing, and they start negotiations. So in 1799, we start negotiations with the new French government under Napoleon. What comes out of that is the Convention of 1800, that in return for giving up all claims of American losses, so those 300 ships are just lost, Adams gets an official suspension of the 78 alliance and an end to the quasi-naval war. So we won't lose any more. We just won't get paid for the ones we've lost. The Senate ratifies it December 21, 1801. So he effectively does restore relations with France, but it's not the best deal he could have gotten, but it was not the best deal he would have hoped to have gotten. It probably was the best deal he could have gotten. But at home, there's an ideological war going on. There is a very vocal split among American citizens and politicians over this war. And the Federalists, and it gets very personal, it gets very volatile. The gentlemanly way to handle an argument in the early 1800s was to shoot each other. In a very civilized way, you had to have a duel. Duels were being fought left and right. Duels were illegal, but that was a gentlemanly act, so most of the time it was just kind of ignored that they were doing that. You could still be charged with murder, but you usually weren't. And it comes down to this. It is getting very personal, very volatile. This is where a lot more of the friendships are going to be lost. Adams bemoans. He had called the group that had the revolutionary group a band of brothers. So that phrase goes way back. And that band was breaking up. But the Federalists pushed through a bunch of acts. And we're going to go through them really quick because I want to get to the end of this. There was the Naturalization Act, and most of these acts are aimed at foreigners. So the Naturalization Act extends the time it takes for a citizen to become, or a person to become a citizen, from 5 years to 14 years. You have to live in the States for 14 years now instead of 5 before you can apply for citizenship. You can't really do anything unless you're a citizen, at least politically. The Alien Act empowered the president to deport, quote, dangerous aliens. So again, you're focusing on foreigners. And I know y'all understand aliens mean people who aren't naturally there, that's not little gray men. So then there's the Alien Enemies Act, which allowed aliens to be expelled or imprisoned during wartime who were not technically at war. Then there's the Sedition Act. That one could apply to naturalized citizens as well. It made it illegal to conspire against the government, including rioting and interfering with a federal officer. It also included writings, like if you were a editor of a newspaper, you couldn't write anything critical of the government during this time. So it kind of limits freedom of speech, freedom of the press. And the Republicans react with the Kentucky and Virginia resolutions. And they denounce the acts as alarming infractions on constitutional rights, and they put forth the ideas of interposition and nullification. Interposition comes from the Virginia one, and nullification comes from the Kentucky one. And basically they're saying the states have the right to decide when Congress has stepped out of bounds and react. Virginia, okay, so the quote is, they quote, have the right and are duty bound to interpose for arresting the progress of evil. And Madison writes that one, and basically he's saying, if Congress steps out of bounds, the states don't have to listen. And they can interpose and stop what Congress is doing. The Kentucky, written by Jefferson, says that a nullification of those sovereignties of all unauthorized acts done under color of that instrument is the rightful remedy. He is arguing that a state can nullify any act that Congress does that the state's rule is out of bounds. These two doctrines aren't really going to be applied at this time, but they're going to become very important as the country grows. This idea, these are states' rights. This is the idea that the states have the right to nullify the national government. And this is going to be very important. So, it's time for another election. 4 years goes really fast. People are unhappy with the Federalist policies, you know, the Alien and Sedition Acts, the Whiskey Rebellion, Jay's Treaty, peace with France. They're unhappy because now we have a standing army and their taxes are paying for it. The Federalists run John Adams again and Charles Pinckney instead of Thomas. The Republicans run Thomas Jefferson and Aaron Burr. This one it gets ugly, but it doesn't get quite as ugly as the first one, partly because Jefferson doesn't participate. Jefferson sits in his home and lets his party fight his battles. He paints himself as the farmer's friend, the states' right advocate, the advocate of frugal government, liberty, and peace. And he lets that ride. Hamilton, again, sinks his party. He writes an internal memo in which he complains about Adams' disgusting egotism. A Republican gets hold of it and it gets printed in the papers. But Adams was actually more popular than his party. He still gets edged out, and the election is a tie between Jefferson and Burr. They tie at 73 each. Well, this is all new territory. Now we have a tie, now what do we do? So they decide it goes to the House, and the House will decide. The Federalists like Burr more than they like Jefferson, even though Hamilton personally hated him, and Hamilton's leader of the Federalists. So the Federalists are all backing Burr now. And they vote 35 times before they can get a win. And the final ballot, Jefferson wins, basically because he promises that he won't remove any Federalist underlings from office. You know, if you've been appointed as a Federalist to a lower office, you're going to be safe. So now the Republicans are going to be in power, but they're not in power yet because there's a period of time between the election and when the new president comes into power. It's called the lame duck. We've gotten rid of that, partially because of this. So in this time break, the Federalists fire their last parting shot. And as Jefferson says, they retreat to the judiciary. They pass the Judiciary Act of 1801. Remember, Congress has the right to say how many judges there are. This is an issue today. They're talking about this now. Because possibly one party is going to have, the conservatives are going to have an edge in the Senate or in the Supreme Court, and it's possible that the Democrats will expand the Supreme Court to get their edge back. Don't know if it's going to happen, but it happens here. This is the basis for this. They expand the court to 16 circuit courts with a new judge each. They increase the number of federal attorneys, clerks, and marshals. Adams names a man named John Marshall as Chief Justice, and he appoints Federalists to all of the new positions, including 42 justices just within the District of Columbia. That's a lot of new Federalists in power. Marshall is going to be Chief Justice for a while, and he is going to change. He's going to really shape the Supreme Court. And this is the Federalist parting shot. They take control of the Supreme Court. This is the first time we transfer power from one party to another, and it's going to stay with the Republicans for quite a while. The South is going to control the White House for the next 24 years. You're going to have Virginia presidents. It signals a new, more democratic political system. Pretty much all the property qualifications for voting have been eliminated. You get a lot wider participation. So we're going to start kind of a new era. Poor Adams was so tired, disgusted, and used up that he skipped all the festivities and just went home. He didn't even go to Jefferson's inauguration. And when he went home, he told his son, John Quincy Adams, who we will talk about again later, that the president has a hard, laborious, and unhappy life. And then said something about he was much happier to trade manure for the White House and go live on his farm. Okay, we are going to stop there. We will start the early Republic on Monday. I am very sorry that we're going to have a test over a weekend, but we're going to have a test over a weekend. I hope y'all have a great weekend. And I'll email you when the test is available. And now I need to breathe.
We finished the topic?
We did.